So I'm here today to talk about technology called Sign In with Google. My name is Lawrence Moroney. I'm a developer advocate. I work out of our Seattle offices, and I focus mostly on Android and on Google Play services. I've been doing a lot of work with identity, a lot of work with Sign In with Google over the last few months, and having a whole lot of fun with the new APIs. And has anybody tried out the new Sign In APIs yet, by the way? Okay, a few, cool. Oh, actually, one thing I forgot before I go back. At the bottom of this slide here, you see I put a URL, j.mp/authfeedback. If you have any questions, any feedback, anything you'd like to let us know about the API, anything you want us to get back to you on, anything like that, there's a simple Google form on there. You can do it anonymously, or you can give us your email address to give us some feedback on that. So, anything along. If I don't have time for questions at the end of the session or anything like that, I promise we'll try and get back to you with answers if you fill in that form. And if there's any really difficult questions, Paul here at this table will be the one to answer them. So he's glad they turned the lights down. So so today I want to really talk about Sign In with Google, and in particular Google Sign In technology. I have a blue button on the screen here, but we actually have a branding guidelines document. There's a link at the end where if you don't like the blue button, we also have a white one. There's also guidelines if you need to customize the button, if you don't like it to say Sign In with Google and you want to localize it to your own language, or maybe something like Pig Latin or something along those lines, then you can actually customize that button. There's lots of resources on there that will allow you to do that. But before I begin talking about signing in with Google, I'm a bit of a stats geek, and I love stats, and I find there's some great ways. I know there are lies, there are darned lies, and there are statistics, but I'm going to use some statistics, and I hope that you find them interesting. So the first of all I'm going to start with is that research has found that 86% of users do not like creating and remembering new passwords to interact with you. What I find stunning about this number is that it's not higher. Right? I mean, I certainly hate going to a new app or going to a new site and having to do yet another sign up, and they probably have different sets of rules for what's a valid password and what isn't a valid password, and I have to, remember all these things, and then 6 months later, the next time I use that site or app, that again, I have to remember what that username and password was. 86% though, according to research. The next number is 54% of users that if you present them with yet another sign up, will quit altogether. So think about all that time that you've spent building your app, maybe making your app work on multiple platforms like iOS, Android, Windows Phone, all the different platforms, maybe working it with a website as well, and having a user's identity with that. All that time building that, all that time marketing that, all that effort that you get for people to access your site or download your app and use it, and more than half of them will walk away if you ask them to build yet another username or password, or sign up with yet another username or password. So that's why technologies like Sign In with Google are very important to me in particular, because I don't want to build apps like this and have more than half of my audience walk away. And one more number is 92%. 92% will give up if they don't remember the username and password that they signed up for on this site. So if they try to, I'm a little active with my hands. If they try to sign in and then they can't remember the username or password and you provide them with a forgotten link, research has shown that 92% of them will just walk away at this point. Right? So it's all very nice to be able to give them that facility to sign in, to recover a forgotten password or identity, but if only 8% of them are using it, that's a lot of wasted effort. And a funny story and a true story is I'm doing grad studies in a university that's not too far from here that I won't name, and they're one of the best IT, one of the best technology universities in the world, and I'm not a matriculated student there. So I come in through what they have as a professional development center. And when I go to their professional development center, to sign into that, I have to give a username and a password. The password on this center has a set of rules about what's a valid password or not. And their set of rules for this one is that you're not allowed to have any capital letters, and you're not allowed to have any punctuation. It's just lowercase letters and numerics. So I come and I sign in and I put in a password for that. And like most people, all of my passwords are kind of variations on a theme, and a very obscure theme that only means something to me. And so no uppercase letters, no punctuation, so I use lowercase letters and a sequence of digits. And then once I'm signed into that, then to access everything in the university, like I'm a real student, so to access email or to access my grades and all that kind of stuff, they have a different username and password, and the password on that, you have to have capital letters and you have to have punctuation. And as a result, I'm like, thoroughly confused whenever I try to sign into this thing, and almost every time I have to reset my password to be able to access my stuff. I'm one of those 8% because I have to access this stuff, so I go through all of that kind of thing. And that to me is really, really annoying, and I'm sure it would be to you too. So the idea and part of our goal with Sign In with Google is to help you to use what you know, to feel secure that your credentials are backed up by this, what we hope and what we believe is a world-class infrastructure. And then if you're a developer, so that you can offer this to your users too. Instead of giving them all of this friction, instead of giving them all of this hassle, instead of different sets of validation rules, instead of having to remember yet another user name and yet another password, that they can just sign in with the Google ID that they already have, or hopefully that they already have. So some of the features behind this. So what we want to do is we want to make it easy and we want to make it familiar for users. You know, most of your users will probably have a Gmail address, and most of your users are familiar with signing in for Gmail. They probably know their username and password for Gmail, and they can sign into your app or your site as frictionlessly as they can with Gmail. We really want to keep it that familiar, and we want to keep it as strong branding on that. They know and they trust Gmail. They sign into it probably every day. It's not a case of a few months later they've forgotten their password. They're using this. It's very easy. It's very familiar for them. It's also secure. One thing I'm going to talk about in a moment is phishing and hacking, and being me, there's lots more stats, so I'll have a lot more stats on phishing and hacking. But before I get to that, one of the things is about security is the back-end infrastructure, the support mechanisms, the overall machine behind securing your user's identity. If it's provided by Google, it's at least as good as the one that you would build yourself, but I would argue it's probably a lot better. You want to focus on building your application, you want to focus on building your site without thinking about all of the time and effort and cost in building and maintaining a world-class security infrastructure. Most of us aren't big enough to be able to do that properly. Whereas if you're using a sign-in with Google type technology, then Google have done that for you. So I think that's something that it's very secure, and it's also really good for your users as well as being really good for you. Then the next part of this, and it's part, I'll be frank, that we kind of failed on, but we're really improving on, is making it easy to code. If you've used Sign-In with Google, if you've tried to build with Sign-In with Google, up until about, I think it was like September of this year, the API was quite complex. There'd be a case of you would try to sign in, and the way that you'd sign in is by connecting a Google API client. But what would happen is the first thing that the user would see is a dialogue asking them, well, which ID are you signing in with? That would actually error out the connection process. And how you as a programmer would handle that is by handling that error. Then once the user has selected their ID, then in many cases the application would ask them for some kind of a permission, like maybe accessing contents, or if you're building something, for example, that uses Google Drive, to give the user to give their permission to access Google Drive. That would also error out the connection process, and you'd have to handle that as if it was an error. And how you knew when the user was signed in was when your Google API connected, and you'd handled all these errors. And as a developer, to me, I found that a little bit ugly. A user picking their name is not an error. A user giving permission is not an error. And so we've really, really improved the API. I'm going to be showing off some of the stuff in the API, so I find it a lot easier. I find it a lot quicker. I find it a lot more straightforward. I hope you do too. And then the next thing is to make it extensible. It's all very well if you've got a mobile device and you've got a sign-in dialog on the mobile device and the user has signed into the device on that, but then what? Most of you likely have some kind of back-end service. Most of you are probably storing some kind of data in that back-end service that as the user signing in, some of the customization of the app comes from that data. And maybe you want that data to be secured too. Now think about what can happen with a middleman attack between the device and your server. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But one of the things about Sign-In with Google is it's not just about your phone. It's not just about your device. It's also about being able to secure back-end services. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the UX and some of the things that we've done to help you focus on the user, reduce some of this friction, and improve the UX. So my speaker notes one is really small here, so I'm going to just turn around. So this is what it used to look like. So on the very left-hand side, you have your application, and you've got a set of sign-in buttons. Like the top one is sign in with Google, the middle one was Facebook, the bottom one I think is Yahoo. So the user would pick sign in with Google. What would happen? Well, first of all, they would get a request asking, can this access their contacts? can this access your contacts? Why, when signing into this application, should this application access my contacts? And there's a rule of thumb that I like to follow, that every time you give the user a choice that really isn't relevant to what they want to do at this moment in time, you lose 90% of them. And to me, this is a great case where you could lose 90% of them. So you then select that one. The user is very nice, and they say, OK, yes, I will. And then they get this, oh, you got to give me permission. And then they say OK to that. And then it's like, OK, once they've given permission, now have to ask for the contacts again. Once they give that permission, now finally, oh, you've got, what account do you want to sign in with? This phone only has one account on it, but yeah, you need to tell me the account that you're going to sign in with. So that's the, what is that? That's the fifth from the left. So once they've picked that one and they sign in, now, guess what? This user didn't have a Google Plus profile. Oh, we can't continue. We need to fill out a Google Plus profile. So they would have to fill out a Google Plus profile. They create that, submit. And then finally, guess what? It's asking them for their basic info, including the list of their contacts. And then they say OK to that. They allow it. And then finally, they're signed into the application. There's a lot of friction here. We understand this. So we've tried to improve it, and we fixed it. So now it looks like this. So now we say, OK, let's get started. Let's sign in with Google. The first thing is, well, we just need to know which account on your phone you're signing in with. In this case, I'm going to pick the account. And then in most cases, I'm straight into the app. There is sometimes there will be another step between the second and third of these, and that's if the user has to give specific permissions to access something. I like to use Google Drive as an example. So if you're building an application that accesses their stuff on Google Drive, then they would have a third step in between the middle one and the one on the right here. But that's how frictionless it has become. We're really, really proud of this. We shipped this in the last version of Google Play Services back in September-ish. And we think it'll make it a lot easier for your users to be able to sign in and to be able to feel secure in signing in without all these dialogues asking them for stuff, sometimes stuff that may not be actually relevant to what they're doing right now. So the next part is I spoke about security. And one of the points, so we've made it easier for your end users. And now we want to talk about security. And I think it's really important in security that security isn't a static thing. Security is always a moving target. And it's really, really important to stay ahead of the game. And as part of like our job at Google is to stay ahead of the game in the security landscape. I like to show this infographic. So this is from a website called informationisbeautiful.net. There's a public link. I have it in my slides. If anybody wants the slides, I can share the link out later. Or if you fill out that form and just ask me, I'll send the link to you. Now, look at all of these breaches and look at all of the users that were impacted by that. Okay, some of these are in the tens of millions of users that were affected by a breach. Some of these we might be familiar with. You know, probably the most famous one recently was the Ashley Madison one, where 36 million users had very, very personal data leaked onto the internet. And then some others, like, you know, some banks and stores and that kind of thing, where people had personal information leaked out, maybe not onto the internet like in the case with the Ashley Madison one, but the overall picture that people have is that their data, their personal details, their credit card, other stuff like that is at risk every single day from hackers. Now, a lot of this stuff, of course, was inside jobs. Some of the retail ones where people had planted a worm inside the credit card scanning machines that was able to collect data about credit cards that were scanned. You know, so it's a little bit of a different scenario than you may be facing when you're building something for sign-in. But the bottom line is, to users, it's all the same. It's really, really a feeling of insecurity that people are out there to get them. And it's our job to at least try to help them feel a little bit more secure when they're using your apps, when they're using your sites, that kind of thing. So you don't want to be this guy, and you want to help them not to be this guy. You know, sometimes I think I should just change my password to incorrect, you know, for this reason. You know, we really want to help them not be this guy. So the next part that I want to talk about a little bit is one of the biggest things where your users are at risk, and that's from phishing scams. Now, there was some research done by the Canadian government, and it spoke about, and this research found that 156 million phishing emails are sent out every single day. Okay, now, by the way, this research was done a couple of years ago, so I think these numbers are probably bigger now. So of those 156 million phishing emails, now, of course, we all have great email filters. We all have great, you know, tools that allow us to filter out and to stop phishing scams and to block them. So how many of that 156 million do you think got through these filters? Anybody take a guess? Somebody say 10%? Oh, that's a good guess. 16 million, all right? Just around 10% actually got through. So when you think about this, a lot of the free email providers like Gmail and Yahoo and Hotmail, etc., they all provide these spam filters. And I'm sure, like many of you, I've gotten my name on all of them, right? I'm El Moroni at Yahoo, at Hotmail, at Gmail, and all these kind of things. And these try their best to keep spam and phishing away from my eyes, but most of them, some are better than others. I won't say which are bad, but most of them try to keep phishing away from my eyes. But some of them do get through. But it's a little bit of a side benefit, I think, if you're using something like a Gmail, because these services receive the most phishing. They're best at identifying phishing, much more than maybe an independent server would be. And as a result, if your users are already using something like Gmail, then they're already being less exposed to phishing scams because less are reaching their inbox. I don't know about you who use Gmail, but I think when I look at phishing emails that are sent to me, far less than 10% get to my Gmail inbox. All right, so 16 million of the 156 million got through filters to end users. How many of those 16 million do you think were actually opened by the end users? 250,000? Okay, it's higher than 250,000. Sorry? 25%? Okay, it's actually higher than 25%. I feel like a game show here, right? 80%, it's lower than 80%. 50%, thank you. It's actually 8 million, about half. Now remember, this is every single day. Users are opening, and this was an older research, I think it's probably higher now. Every single day, users were found to be opening 8 million phishing scams. Okay, next question. Most phishing scams have a link in them, right? To say, the typical phishing scam is like, oh, I'm from insert email service here. Your password has failed. Please sign in here to change your password. That's the typical one. So there's usually a link that you go to a fake website where they harvest your password. So how many of those 8 million do you think the people actually clicked on the link and went to the website? 1 million. Okay, that's close enough. It's 10%. It's about 800,000. So every single day, 800,000 of these links are clicked on, and people are going to sites with phishing scams on them. All right, you go to this site. Now, a lot of the time, you've gone to this site, and most people in this room, I'm sure, are smart enough to look at the URL and see that, hey, look, this URL isn't yahoo.com or google.com or wherever, Facebook or wherever. It's, bob.biz/something. And nowadays, browsers have that little green thing that they put in the address bar to show that this really is certified, that this is the correct site. But 800,000 of these people have gone to these sites. How many of them do you think were still fooled and actually entered their user data? Half? Okay, thank God it's a bit less than that. It's still 10%. It's about 80,000. So per day, 80,000 people fall for a phishing scam. And many of those usernames and passwords are compromised. People might be using the same username and password on other sites. Like I said, for me, there's a phrase that I know that nobody else knows, and most of my passwords kind of root off of that phrase by changing letters around or adding numbers or punctuation, and it helps me to remember passwords. So had I gone to one of these phishing sites, and if any of fishers are watching this live stream, they now know that my password has that kind of combination, so maybe I need to change it. But if they've gotten one of these sources of my password, then they already have several steps towards being able to compromise my account in other places. So it's a tough landscape out there, and it's up to us as app developers and as site developers to protect our end users in that. So as part of the value that we try to offer with Google Sign-In, all of this kind of stuff becomes possible. So when you use a Gmail sign-in, when you use a Google account, I'm sure a lot of you, like me, travel around, maybe around the country, maybe around the world. You've probably encountered these things that, I was in England 2 weeks ago, and when I tried to sign in England, Google didn't challenge me. I then, the following day, went to Wales, and when I tried to sign in from Wales, Google were like, this is suspicious activity. we're going to challenge you for some extra details just to make sure that, you really are moving around. You've been in 3 countries in 3 days. What's really going on here? And it was that extra layer of security that Google were able to provide to protect my password in case somebody really was scamming me, somebody really was taking that kind of thing. Another tool that's in there is being able to sign out of sessions remotely. Now, one of the things that's nice is that if you use like internet cafes or that kind of thing and you sign into your Gmail and you forget about it, you can go and you can sign out remotely. But it's also really nice that, hey, you've gotten this warning. We've detected suspicious activity on your account. Somebody in Wales has tried to sign into your account. What's going on here? You can then go and just kick that person out remotely before you change your password details, things like that. Unusual activity alerts, same kind of thing. If there's strange activity going on, you get alerts sent to you. You can have like alerts, details and all that texted to you and whatever. There's some intelligent challenges on there for the same reason. There's all of this infrastructure designed to protect your username and password. So if you were one of these people who was, inadvertently gave some details out in a phishing scam, you can find out right away, when your users or when you are using a Google identity. So, of course, and then there's all the infrastructure that I mentioned behind it, all the security of the infrastructure. One of the main places that passwords get compromised is that somewhere in a system, they're stored in a place that's unencrypted. Or maybe they're passing from A to B across an infrastructure that's unencrypted, and it's easy for somebody to sniff that off a network. And as a result, passwords can be compromised. Again, the infrastructure that's behind Google's credential system, behind our ID system, hopefully doesn't have any of that. We haven't had any, at least that I know of right now, any major compromises to that kind of thing. So again, if your users are using Google Identity, if they're using any kind of sign-in with Google, all of this back-end is there for them. So enough about the user. What about the developer story? And I'm thinking about, I've mentioned earlier on about there were some difficulties and there were some like bumps in the road that you have when you try to sign in. So we've tried to make it a lot easier, and I'm going to talk through some of the steps here. I'm not going to demo it because unfortunately the emulator doesn't yet run the version of Google Play Services that has this on it, and it's just too awkward to try and do it with a device while I'm on stage. So I'm just going to demo by showing the code. So first step, instead of connecting directly to a Google API client, the API has this thing called a Google Sign-In Options object, or we just call it a GSO for short. So your first task is to create a GSO, and in this case I'm doing a very simple one. I'm not requesting any additional permissions other than the basic email identifier, and thinking about just the person's email address as the thing that they identify themselves with. You saw that dialogue earlier with the pop-up where it was like Nikhil Cortlet and his email address. That's what springs this. And this doesn't require any permissions from the user other than just filling in that account picker. If you were, for example, to access Google Drive, or you wanted to access Google Drive or any other things, there will be an additional dot on here before the dot build, and then the user will get the dialogue saying, hey, this app also wants to access Google Drive, etc. But if you're doing this, and this is the basic and the most common case, you're just going to have those 3 steps that I showed in the earlier slide. Okay, next now, if you've built with Google Play Services, and if you've built with authentication and identity with Google Play Services, you'll know about the Google API client. And here's where you set up the Google API client. You create it with a builder, and you access it with the add API, and you pass it the GSO that you just created earlier on, the second parameter there. It's auth.google sign-in API, and you just pass it that GSO object, and that GSO object had the configurations for the type of permissions that you want to access. Right, so it's as simple as that. The function to determine it, there's an auth class, there's a constant on there, and that constant is the Google Sign-In API. So now you've created a GSO, you've created your Google API client. So the next thing to do is to get a sign-in intent from the API for this Google API client. And you can see it's here. I just create intent.sign-in-intent equals auth.Google Sign-In API. I pass it the API client. Remember, the API client was configured with the sign-in object, and then I start an activity for that result. There's a constant on the right-hand side there, RC sign-in. That's not part of the API. Usually, if you're building an application and you start an activity so that Android can tell which activity result is for which activity, you just pass it an integer. And it can be anything that you want. It's just up to you to do. If you've got multiple activities going on, it's up to you to identify them with your own constants. So in this case, this constant RC sign-in, I think we made it. There's a sample that you can download that I took this code from. I think it was like 7001. So when you get the call back saying, hey, we got a result for activity 7001, you know that it's that one, that it's the sign-in one. But like I said, it can be anything you like. And then you can see the callback here, where you catch the activity result. And it's so you get your on activity results, and then on the activity result, you have a request code. Remember the request code that I said that you passed in? If it's that request code that you created for the sign-in activity, then all you have to do is create a Google sign-in result object, and this is going to be the result of the call to Google Sign-in API .get sign-in result from the intent. And the intent passes you back the data parameter that you can see at the top. So now you have your sign-in result, and this sign-in result object gives you everything that you need to know about the sign-in, such as the account. And the account is a Google sign-in account object, and you get that using the result.get sign-in account, as it suggests. And then you can query that account object for things that the user has given you permission to, including, hey, has this user actually signed in or not, that kind of thing. So now that you have your accounts, now you can personalize your application for that end user, and it's as simple as that. And again, just to look at the flow again, it looks like this. The user clicks the Connect with Google button. They get given the picker, which asks them which account do they want to sign in with. They pick that account, and then they're taken to your application. And you can customize your application as you please for that user. Like in this case, we have the user's name and a picture and stuff at the top for that user. And as I mentioned before, that if you're doing additional scopes, for example, the one I always like to use is Drive, that if your app is going to access the user's Drive, there'll be an additional step in between, the middle one and the right one there, where the user has to give permission to that. So this is great, but guess what? This is all very nice for authenticating on the device, but what happens when you want to extend beyond that? And I like to give a story here. There was, before I joined Google, I was an independent application developer. I worked for a lot of startups building applications for them. And there was one startup that I worked with that they had this really interesting app for a very unique audience. And their audience was people who own pets, who hire other people to look after their pets for them. So part of this was like, I have a dog. I'll use my own dog. My dog is called Bucky. And if I, for example, work too much and I can't walk Bucky, then I can hire somebody to walk Bucky for me. But how do I know that that person has actually walked my dog for me? Right? So the idea behind this app was that I would have my person that I've hired use this app. So then as they're looking after my dog during the day, as they're walking the dog, it would collect data around that. It would collect data of where they walked and all that kind of stuff. It was an interesting little concept. But of course, in order to be able to use this, people needed to sign up for this service so that they register that I am who I am, and here's my password, that I sign in, and I add dog walkers to my account. And so first of all, we hit the first barriers that I was talking about earlier on of yet another sign up that people had to do. So we thought, okay, let's add social, let's add sign in with Google, let's add sign in with Facebook, let's add sign in with Yahoo and sign in with Microsoft, and all these kind of things to the app. So it makes it easier for people to get into it. So that was the first part, and it was all very nice. But then we had all this back-end data, and the back-end data example including the address of the person who owns the dog. The site where the dog gets walked, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, it's not crazy sensitive data, such as like bank account details or other stuff that has been leaked on the internet in the recent past, but it's potentially sensitive. People know where I live. Maybe I have a really expensive breed of dog that could be kidnapped. Who knows? So there is sensitive data there. So how do we secure that back-end data? And it's all very nice that if we had a sign-in with Google that gets people into my application locally on my device and I can customize it for them. But what then if those credentials get passed up to my back-end server and I start needing to identify the person on the back-end server? Now suddenly you can have a middleman coming in and maybe a middleman posting stuff to my server saying, yes, this is Lawrence Moroney. It's lmoroney@gmail.com. Give me his details. Okay, so we need to be really careful about extending, our applications to handle that. So here's an example. Like, here's my app. My app has signed it. By the way, do you love my diagrams? I'm not the most artistic person in the world. So, my app has a sign-in with Google. Google has provided an identity for my user, and maybe I'm keying that identity off the user's email address. I then pass that email address up to my server, and what can happen is the bad guys can say, I can pass an email to the server as well. And then what happens? If I pass the email to the server as well, the server might be able to post back to me some of the details about this person. That would be bad. So part of the extensibility of sign-in with Google that we've done is saying, okay, let's treat this a little bit differently. Okay, my application, as well as being able to sign in and get an identity from the user, such as their email, I can also get this token. And this token says, okay, elmaroney@gmail.com has signed in. He's signed in at this time. Here's some of the metadata around that. Here's how we're signing that. Here's how we're encrypting and securing that. And my app can pass that token up to my server. So now the server passes that token to Google and gets an ACK back saying, yes, this is good, or this really is a token that we issued. This really is elmaroney@gmail.com. This isn't some kind of fake. This is the person. Now, how we can do this, there's two ways. The way that we recommend is we've got a set of libraries that you can do this. So those libraries do that communication on your behalf. And I have a few code snippets I'll show in a moment that show them. But we also have an endpoint that you can call. Then you can just call that endpoint and get the data back. We recommend the endpoint for debugging. And it's all in the docs. I have some links at the end of the slide. But we recommend the libraries for production work. So now if a bad guy comes in and the bad guy passes up a fake token, of course, the usual security happens. Your server can then try and pass the fake token to Google, and Google come back and go, that's not going to happen, and then you will know. So it just secures your back-end server with your user's identity from Google that much better. So let's look a little bit at the code for this. Okay, remember earlier on, the first step on your Android application was creating the GSO. Well, one of the things I've just highlighted in red here, I've added another method to this, and this method was request ID token. And I passed this thing called a server client ID in there. And a server client ID is this unique ID that's generated for your server. There are steps in our documentation that show you how to do that. It's a big, long, ugly string that you can just put as a constant in your app, or any other way that you want to do it. And so when you call the request ID token, now once the user signed in, once you get that successful sign-in, you're able to get that token too. So that's the only change that you need to make to your GSO sign-in. So then step 2, when you're setting up your Google API client, spot the difference. There is no difference, right? So it's exactly the same thing. You don't need to change anything in your code for setting up the Google API client. Now step 3, to get the sign-in intent, it's exactly the same. We've added that one line of code to the GSO, but creating the Google API client, calling the Google API client, connecting it, and getting the sign-in intent back, the flow is exactly the same. But then once you get your result back, so earlier, if you remember this one, on our activity results coming back, if the activity was the RC sign-in activity, when we get our result back and we get our account back, there's a method on the account, which is get the ID token. So this gets the token for us. We have this token now in our client upon a successful sign-in, and it's a simple case of posting that token to the server, right, to our own server, and then our server, when I say our, I don't mean Google. I mean our if I'm the application developer. So my backend server is an application developer, post the token to that, and then that token can be posted to Google and authorized by Google on your behalf. So again, just looking at that flow, here, my application, the user has signed in with Google. They've gotten the identity token from that. They post the token to the server. So now Google will get the server, hack it, and send it back so we avoid the bad guys doing it. And let's see what the code for that would look like. Here's how you process the code on your server. Sorry, I need to turn around because I can't read it on my laptop. And so first of all, the ID token string is that token that's come from your Android client, has been posted to the server just as a string on an HTTP post, or hopefully an HTTPS post, a secure post, and you get your ID token. So you want to just check if it's not null. Now you have this on the API. This is not part of the Android API. This is part of the libraries that I mentioned that you can use on your backend server, the Google libraries for authentication. An object in there is called, surprise, surprise, a Google ID token verifier. The Google ID token verifier is then built just using a couple of objects, a transport and a JSON factory. But the important thing is 2 things that you need to do. Number 1, you need to set the audience. Now, the audience can be a number of different servers, because you may have multiple servers posting into this thing and you want the audience for each of these. In this scenario, I just have one, and the ID for that, if you remember us talking earlier about the server client ID. I know it sounds like an oxymoron, a server client, but it's the client ID from your server to Google servers. And so you set the audience with that ID, and then you set the issuer, and the issuer is just accounts.google.com. And then you build this thing, and then after you've built this thing, you can then just verify your token by calling verifier.verify that actual string that was posted up. And if that comes back as not null, then you know this token has a payload associated with it. The payload, all the things in orange on this slide, by the way, are part of the API. So the payload that you create from that ID token has something, for example, a method in it, which is the get subject, and that just gives you the user ID. So if you think about the flow, the user on your device tries to sign in. When they sign in, Google issue a token to your device. Your device then gets that token and posts it to your server. Your server gets that token and posts it back to Google. Google then verify that token and come back and say, this is the user ID associated with that token. So you have the complete flow from your device to your server securely for your actual end user. So then if you're building, for example, a dog walker application and you don't want a nefarious third party to access data such as the breed of your dog or your address or where you live, this is a great way of doing that. So all of this data that's in flight is much more secure than if it was just an email being passed to your server to identify the end user. So that's really part of the value, and that's what Sign In with Google is all about, and that's why we're working so hard to make it the best technology we possibly can. So all of those above scenarios that I spoke about become possible. Hopefully you avoid your users having the issues that I spoke about earlier on, where many of them walk away if they don't get the data, if they forget their password and stuff like that. There's a few resources that I've put here. So the main website that we have, developers.google.com/identity, has all of the background information on this, as well as some more complex scenarios. There's one that I haven't gone into here, but to describe it briefly was, we spoke about your server being able to access Google's backend to verify that a person is who they say they are. But what if, using my Drive scenario again, if you've built it so that you're requesting Drive on the phone, and the person's able to access Drive on their phone, that's all very well. But what if you want your server to access Drive on their behalf? Maybe instead of the dog walks being saved on the phone, you want to save them to the user's Drive and you want your server to be able to do that, or something along those lines. There's a more complex flow that you have to think about, because now you're having your server talk to your end users' identities on their behalf, accessing stuff which could be sensitive in their Google Drive on their behalf, etc. And you want to make sure that's secure. I don't have all the details in this talk to go through that, but those kind of scenarios, as well as the two that I mentioned, are all on developers.google.com/identity. There's a really, really great sample code. It's on GitHub under Google Samples, Google Services. And the sample code actually has 4 scenarios in it. The first scenario of simple sign-in that I've shown. The second scenario of simple sign-in, but with Drive on the device being shown. The third scenario of authenticating against your backend server that I've shown. And then the fourth scenario, that more complex one that we're saying, where your server may need to also authenticate against Google services on your user's behalf. That's also in that sample, so it's pretty cool. And then finally, if you frequent androiddevelopers.blogspot.com, we actually have an ongoing series on identity. There's a post actually going out today about all the server scenarios that I mentioned. So great resource. Go take a look at that if you're interested in anything identity. And of course, reach out to me or any of the team. I gave a form at the beginning of the talk, and here it is again. So j.mp/authfeedback. And with that, just like to say thank you for coming and spending some time with us. I have 3 minutes for questions, so if we have one here. Yep, in the center here. Oh, waiting for Mike.
Some applications might have some sort of age restrictions. So is there any way to check for age, or if they haven't already put their age in their Google account, ask them to provide it?
That's a good question. Is there an access on the ID object for their age? This is Paul from the identity team.
Hi guys. So basically, what it sounds like is you need actually additional information that we don't provide. So we don't provide specific ages and things in profile. So actually, once they've signed up with their Google account, I would then ask them additional questions to build out their profile. So it saves you asking for a username, password, and everything. But then the rest of the information you might need, you would request at that point in your sign-up flow. By that point, they've already got a login, so you could potentially delay it to later on if you don't need that age immediately. Sort of say, kind of like you may have seen LinkedIn and other sort of social network sites ask, hey, your profile isn't 100% complete. Maybe you can add this information later on and encourage them to do so with benefits and things, but that's typically how we see it done. Okay. There may also be age restrictions on how young you can be to have a Google account. Don't know off the top of my head, but if you post a question to that, we can confirm that.
Over here.
Does the new flow request any permission? Like you show in the old flow, you require this get contact. all the context permission?
So it will request permissions in a number of scenarios, like if there are things that you're requesting that need that additional permission. I use Drive as an example. But if you're just saying the .request email on the GSO, then there's no further permissions required.
So, sorry, just to add to that, are you talking about Android permissions or user permissions? So, like with Android M specifically, the great thing about this new library is that it actually removes any get accounts permission. So there's no sort of system dialog permissions that you need to request now to use Google Sign-In. And so that's actually one of the beauties of updating to the latest versions of the API is that you can remove that whole step. That was one of the steps that was actually in the horrific slide with thousands of steps. So as far as that's concerned, Android permissions, there's no permissions requested from the user, like contacts or camera or anything like that. There's just the permissions you're asking for the services you're trying to use.
Okay, thank you.
I've only time for one more, maybe at the front here. So any other questions, please just fill them out on this form and we'll get back to you.
Quick question. The Google Drive and YouTube authentication, that's just going to work with this as well? So if we want to post from the app to YouTube or access Google Drive, do we need to do anything extra?
So, of course, there'll be Drive APIs for accessing Drive itself. You'll need to do that. This is just the permissions layer to give you access to that.
But authentication, like once I do this, it should just all work, right?
Yeah, so for example, if you've got multiple accounts on your phone, as many of us do, then there's multiple ways into Drive and there's multiple access points on Drive. So if your application provides the identity to Drive that you've signed in with, it will be that Drive account that you're able to access.
Right. So the new sign-in APIs just replace the sign-in that used to happen on Connect and everything. This now, you'll notice that it's still feeding back into the same Google API client, so that still functions in the same sort of way. So this is all about the process that happens in the sort of startup of the API client, the Connect, and all the rest of it.
All right, thanks everybody. And again, any questions, just fill them out in that form. It's j.mp/authfeedback. Thank you.